Lesson 27, what is shutter speed and how does it work? When you press the shutter release button on your camera, this opens the shutter and then it closes again. This allows a certain amount of light to come into your camera and affect the sensor in the back of the camera. How long the shutter remains open is called the shutter speed. And the shutter speed is one of the three controls, along with the aperture and the ISO, that manage your exposure. This is why it's one of the most important settings on your camera to learn to use well. The shutter in your camera is a pair of curtains or blinds, and when you press the button, the first curtain will open, and this exposes the sensor to light, and then the second one will close. This function on a phone is a little different because when you take a photo, it just turns the sensor on and off rather than opening and closing a shutter. But it has the same effect of controlling how much light affects the sensor. The length of time the shutter is open, depending on how much light there is when you're taking photos, must be carefully balanced with your aperture setting and your ISO setting. Shutter speeds are measured in fractions of seconds and seconds, sometimes even longer. Your camera will also have a setting called bulb on the shutter speed choices. This allows you to take photos with the shutter open for as long as you want. The maximum timed setting on your camera may be about 30 seconds. So using the bulb setting, you can take photos with an exposure time of longer than 30 seconds. With your camera set to shutter priority mode, you get to control the shutter speed and the camera chooses the aperture setting. In manual mode, you also get to control the shutter speed, but you must also manually adjust the aperture setting. On both modes, you've got the option to use either auto ISO or manual ISO. I always recommend using manual ISO settings. So in manual mode, when you need to choose all the settings, it's a little bit more to think about, but it does give you extra creative control because you get to choose your exposure setting rather than the camera choosing it for you. Most of the time, when the light's good, you'll have a shutter speed setting that usually fits in the range between, say, a 60th of a second and around 1/500th of a second. And so when the light's very bright, a fast shutter speed is most common, but in lower light situations, you'll probably have to use a slower shutter speed. Many new cameras and lenses now have image stabilization included. So this allows you to use a slower shutter speed without risking blur from camera movement during an exposure. This varies from camera to camera, and it also depends on how steadily you can hold your camera. It's helpful to think about the shutter speed numbers when you're setting your exposure. Each time you halve or double your shutter speed, you're allowing twice as much or half as much light to enter the camera. So a shutter speed setting of a 100th of a second lets in twice as much light as a shutter speed setting of 1/200th of a second. So thinking about your shutter speed settings like this can help you predict what setting you might want to use depending on the lighting conditions and your aperture and ISO settings. The most important thing to remember about shutter speed settings is the lower the number, the more light will enter the camera, and the higher the shutter speed, the less light will enter the camera because the shutter is only open for a very short period of time. Lesson 27, practical exercise. What is shutter speed and how does it work? In this exercise, you'll learn how to better manage your shutter speed in relation to the aperture setting that you're choosing. This exercise will be best outdoors in the daytime. Find a static subject, one that's not moving. Set your exposure mode to shutter priority and your ISO to 100. Then adjust your shutter speed to the fastest shutter speed that you've got on your camera. This will be the highest number. On my camera, this is 1/8000th of a second. And take a couple of photos. Once you've taken a couple of photos, check your monitor and have a look at the results. It's probably going to be black. You're probably not going to see any image on your monitor because your shutter speed's so fast. Even on a sunny day, your camera's probably not going to balance the exposure well with the shutter speed so fast and your ISO at 100. When your camera is set to shutter priority mode, it will choose the aperture itself based on the shutter speed that you have set. Setting the fastest shutter speed, the camera is going to use the widest aperture, and with only 100 ISO, the sensor is not going to receive enough light to make a well-exposed photo. So in this instance, because the shutter speed was so fast and the aperture on my lens only opens up to f4, I've got a blank image. It's black. There's no light recorded whatsoever. So you need to be aware of this when you're using shutter priority mode. Now take a series of photos, halving your shutter speed each time you take a photograph. So my shutter speed now will go from 1/8,000th of a second down to 1/4,000th of a second. I'll take a photo, and then I'll halve it again to 2,000, 1,000, and so on. Watch your aperture setting as you're doing this, and review them on your monitor to see what the results look like. And check what happens when you've got to that really slow shutter speed. What is the aperture that your camera's choosing, and are you getting a good exposure, or is your image overexposed? If your camera can't choose a narrower aperture, it will result in an overexposed photo. The main points for this lesson are: shutter speeds are measured in fractions of seconds and seconds. A shutter speed must balance with the aperture and ISO settings. Image stabilization helps you handhold when using slower shutter speeds. Practice this to improve your photography. Remember to always check your shutter speed and aperture settings, no matter what exposure mode you're using.